the Lemkos are unique, that is, unique among all of Europe's Carpatho-Rusyns, in that they hold the dubious distinction, a dubious and unenviable distinction, of having been removed from their homelands, that is, deported, and settled permanently elsewhere. In essence, within a few years after World War II came to an end in 1945, the traditional Lemko region, that is lands, as you see there on our map of present-day Poland, for centuries they were the dominant population in that region, marked in green on Poland, where they were the dominant population, and culture was Carpatho-Rusyn. Now, after the war, that ceased to exist. Now, the reasons for that had to do with international factors, and in particular the politics or the policies of the state in which Lemko-Rusyns once again found themselves after the war, and that is Poland. Now, as for Poland, the victorious Allied powers, this time in World War II, had agreed during their wartime deliberations that Poland, brutally wiped off the map in the fall of 1939, which precipitated World War II, the Allies all agreed that Poland should be reconstituted as a state. The borders of the Polish state, always problematic during World War I as well, and now during World War II, the borders reconstituted would be the country, but the borders to be changed, and to be changed in a radical manner, almost as if the entire country was simply picked up and moved westward. So if we look on this map and we can see the boundaries of Poland going way out here during the interwar years, after World War II, literally it's kind of like picked up and moved westward, as you can see on the orange portion of that map to my left. Poland's pre-war eastern region, the term that the Poles used for that was called Kresy. These areas here, primarily inhabited way up in the north by Lithuanians, Belarusians, and Ukrainians, all lopped off after the war and were annexed to the Soviet Union and assigned respectively to the Lithuanian, Belarusian, and Ukrainian Soviet Socialist republics. Poland was on the winning side of the war, so it had to be compensated. And in compensation for those losses, Poland was given territories that before the war were part of Germany, not only part of Germany, but inhabited almost exclusively by Germans. And in particular, two areas here called Silesia and Pomerania up on the coast. Also, southern part of East Prussia. So these three areas that you can see with those red lines. And the new boundary or the extent of Poland was along the Oder and the Neisse rivers. All of these territories with these lines were referred to in official Polish sources as the Ziemie odzyskane, that is, the recovered lands. Very specific term, that is a designation that implied that this was nothing new for Poland. that in the early medieval times, these areas were inhabited by Slavs, of course, ancestors in this case of modern Poles, and they were inhabited by Slavs until they were driven out as part of the general medieval Germanic push to the east, Drang nach Osten. And so now they're being recovered. Now, technically, the lands east of this two rivers, the Oder and the Neisse River, technically, they were assigned by the Allied powers to Poland on a temporary basis. That is, temporary until a peace treaty with Germany could be signed. Now, the war ended in 1945. I don't know if you can imagine when the peace treaty was finally signed with Poland. In 1991. And I know this as a young student your age when I first started going to Europe and working actually in Luxembourg way back in 1964. So the first time. Right, I wasn't a child either in 1964. But in any case, I remember very well watching the news, German news, and until 1991, on the German news when they showed the weather map, and they have the boundaries of the country, right? Boundaries of the country were always the boundaries of up to 1939, which included all of these areas of Poland. Why? A formal peace treaty was never signed. After 1991, the weather maps changed. Now, as I've mentioned in previous lectures, the immediate post-war years, post-World War II years, were characterized by a belief among leaders in many European states, and not only European states, and that included the Allied powers, that population exchange was a legitimate and an effective way to eliminate the national minority problem. The national minority problem, which was considered the major cause of the recent world conflict, World War II. No country in Europe experienced the degree of population transfer as did Poland. The very fact that it was physically moved, well, aside from it being this territory physically moved, also people were physically moved. Virtually all of moved or disappeared in one way or another. Virtually all of pre-World War, World War II Poland's, that is interwar Poland's 2.7 million Jewish inhabitants had been killed in the Holocaust. As for post-war Poland, 3.2 million Germans, 3.2 million Germans were expelled from these age-long, centuries-old German territories, from those Polish recovered lands. And at the same time, 1.7 million Poles arrived from Soviet territory, that is, those living in what was now Belarus and Western Ukraine, as part of these population exchanges. And in turn, 500,000 Ukrainians, Belarusians, and Lithuanians were settled, who were left here, settled east of that line. These massive shifts in population, basically completed by 1947, but there was still, they couldn't get everybody. There were still some people who were non-Polish, but the percentage now of the population in Poland was very small, no more than 3 to 4%. I always like to show this map that I created, which I call the leftovers. No matter all of the efforts made for moving millions of people after World War II, I've only given you the example of Poland. This happened throughout the European continent. Still, after it was all done, this is your post-World War II map of Europe with the black lines, and you see all those colors. let alone all those little, there's still non-dominant peoples left over, so-called national minorities, the leftovers. So despite all the effort, you still have countries with more than one nationality living within them, which obtains more or less to today. Now, aside from boundary changes and population transfers, restored Poland had a new political system as early as July 1944, before the war even ended. A communist-dominated Polish provisional government was formed in exile, actually in the Soviet Union, and with the backing of the Soviet Union. And so they took power right after the Germans were moved out. This new communist rule state eventually was named the Polish People's Republic. And following the model of the Soviet Union, Communist Poland introduced a command economy. It nationalized all privately owned enterprises, collectivized a large portion, although not all, of the agricultural sector. And like in the other countries that we spoke about, certainly the Soviet Union and in Slovakia or Czechoslovakia, the policies of the government were determined by the Polish Communist Party, often in close collaboration with Soviet advisors. And so Poland became one of the Soviet satellite states after World War II, like Czechoslovakia, Hungary, etc. Now, among the relatively small number of inhabitants of non-Polish nationality that were left over in the country after these post-war population transfers were the Lemko-Rusyns. I mentioned last time, or in one of the lectures, already between late 1944 and 1946, that was during the transition period that we talk about after the war, on the basis of a Polish-Soviet agreement, the majority of the Lemko-Rusyn population, actually about 80,000, was resettled eastward to Soviet Ukraine. This was late 1944 through 1946. But there still remained, still even after that, an estimated 25,000 to 30,000 Lemkos still living in their ancestral villages, located mostly in the western areas of the Lemko region, that is west of the Dukla Pass, when you know where that is. Now, on the one hand, Communist Poland formally adopted the Soviet principle of non-discrimination and also support for the cultural aspirations of national minorities. Also following the Soviet model, all Carpatho-Rusyns, and that included Lemkos, were considered part of the Ukrainian nationality. There were no Carpatho-Rusyns. We saw that last time. So yes, we recognize national minorities, and in the case of Lemko-Rusyns, they're Ukrainians. On the other hand, however, communist policymakers were not opposed to the goal of transforming Poland into an ethnically homogeneous state inhabited primarily, if not exclusively, by Poles. Poland for Poles. But this is a contradiction in a sense. How then to square these contradictory goals, that is, tolerance for national minorities on the one hand, and Polish ethnic homogeneity on the other. Now, in the case of the remaining Lemkos, remember, about 80,000, late 44, 45, 46, transferred east to Soviet Ukraine. Now we have about another 30,000 left over. What to do with them? Well, a solution seemed to present itself in the form of the UPA. Remember I said we're going to hear this more and more. It'll never go away, and maybe this is the last time we're going to be speaking about it, maybe. The UPA stands for the Ukrainian insurgent army. Founded in 1943 during the war, and as we saw more than once, was engaged in a struggle to create a non-communist Ukraine, and was fighting against the Poles, the Germans, the Soviets, the Partisans, was fighting against everybody. And that we saw, as I said the last time, how by 1944, they were pushed out and found refuge in the Carpathian Mountains, mostly in the eastern half of the Lemko region. And so that area right up here, that is the borderland between the three countries, this is where the UPA is held up. Polish security forces fought several skirmishes against this UPA, but were unable to drive them out of the region until early 1947, when they were assisted in their efforts both by Soviet and Czechoslovak army units. And so, only then, in 1947, was the UPA finally removed from this area. Some of them left and crossed Czechoslovakia to cross the mountains into Czechoslovakia, then walked across Czechoslovakia to the western zones of Germany, post-war Germany. Others, some of them went east and continued their underground activity against Soviet rule. This concerted effort, military effort, against the UPA provided the Polish authorities with a convenient excuse to rid the southeastern corner of the country of whatever remaining Lemkos, and for that matter, ethnic Ukrainians live there. Because remember I said there were leftovers. No less than 20,000 Polish army troops were sent to the region to carry out what came to be known as the Vistula Operation. The Vistula Operation. 1947. Between April, the very end of April, and August 12th that year, 1947, an estimated 155,000 people, of whom about 35,000 were Lemkos, forcibly evacuated from their homes, often with only a few hours' notice, and resettled where? In the northern and western regions of Poland, that is, Pomerania and Silesia, where the Germans were driven out. This tragic event, which is remembered among Lemko-Rusyns as the Lemko Road to Calvary, always the Christian elements here, effectively put an end to the centuries-old Carpatho-Rusyn character of the Lemko region. And so as a result of the earlier, quote-unquote, voluntary resettlement east in late 44 through 46, and now this forced deportation of 1947 to the western parts of post-war Poland, many Lemko villages in the mountains, especially in the eastern part of the region, simply ceased to exist. Houses and churches were left to decay, and within a few years they crumbled and were overrun by vegetation and trees. If you travel there today, the only thing you see are cemeteries. Other villages were resettled by Poles, brought by the government from other parts of Poland, or by those Poles repatriated from post-war Soviet Union. But whatever their origin, these newcomers had no sense of belonging, They're in this strange land up in the mountains. No sense of pride or respect for the Lemko villages that they were given. They chose the best houses and land, leaving the rest to decay. And during the long winters, it was certainly easier to gather firewood by tearing down a nearby house or a barn, for that matter a church, than by felling trees in the forest. And so during the early 1950s, the material and cultural vestiges of the Rus past in the Lemko region were, as I said, with the exception of cemeteries, largely obliterated. Not that the cemeteries were maintained, but the stones were still there, and some of the metal crosses falling on the ground. Driven by gunpoint from their homes, the deportation process itself proved a traumatic experience. When the deportees finally reached their destinations, again, in those former Germanic territories, Silesia and Eastern Pomerania, the Polish authorities settled them in small towns and villages, but deliberately made sure that Lemkos, and for that matter the Ukrainians who were also deported from the east, would not comprise more than 10% of the population in any given locality. So we're not creating another kind of land where all of the people are the same. So you spread them out. There were, of course, some Lemkos who refused to leave and go settle abroad. Literally, in their language, they called it na chuzhiny. That is, I'm abroad. Abroad, settling abroad means within the western lands of Poland. It's still a term that they use. Some of them even tried to return to their Carpathian homeland, although they were almost always turned back. One example, it was an exceptional example, was a painter from a town in the Lemko region. His name was Nikifor, a famous naive painter. In the world art, you can find him in any major dictionary or encyclopedia of naive art. Couldn't speak, half deaf, and he kind of lived outside for most of his life. Point is, he was deported like the rest. What does he know and what does he can't? He walks back to his native village, starts painting on the streets. That's what he liked to do. He was arrested, sent back, and he walks back again. He's arrested a second time, sent back to the West, comes back again, and then they said, the hell with him, let him stay there, leave him alone. There's only one of them. Can't do much harm. From the late 1950s, a small number of individuals did manage to gain official permission from the government authorities to return to their native villages, but they could not get back their old homes. After all, they were now occupied by Polish owners, if they weren't totally destroyed, and therefore they were forced to build new ones, often on the outskirts of the village. Despite such difficulties, by the late 1990s, about 6,000, maybe as many as 10,000, Lemko-Rusyn families managed to return to the Carpathian homeland, but that, of course, was only a tiny proportion of the 140,000 that had lived in the Lemko region before World War II. Like the Soviet Union and Czechoslovakia, which we looked at in our last lectures, creating a new world according to the Soviet model. So, too, like those other two countries, Poland had to deal with the Greek Catholic Church. The task in Poland was a little bit easier. Why? Because of the unique conditions related to the depopulation of the Lemko region. Now, Poland's communist authorities accepted the Soviet view that after the council that was held in Lviv, now in Soviet Ukraine, of 1946, at which the Greek Catholic Church ceased to exist in historic Galicia, and this was part of historic Galicia, western part of Galicia nonetheless, was under the jurisdiction of the Eparchy of Przemysl, and then the Lemko Apostolic Administration. But based on this premise, the Polish government issued decrees which first nationalized Greek Catholic Church property, already in 1947, and then 2 years later in 1949 legitimized the seizure of the property, arguing that it belonged to, quote-unquote, juridical persons whose existence and activities lost their purpose as a result of resettlement of their members to the Soviet Union. The Stalinist principle, no people, no problem. No people, no property. What do you need property for a church for? And as a result of these decrees, the Greek Catholic Church in Poland was delegalized. They never abolished it, they just delegalized it. Church property in the Lemko, now depopulated Lemko-Rusyn villages was, as I said, left to decay and eventually disappear. In those villages, Lemko villages that were resettled by Poles, former Greek Catholic churches were often appropriated by the Roman Catholic Church, or in the case of wooden ones, as I said, often left to decay, torn down, or use them to store hay or whatever, and then eventually burn them up as firewood. Now, those Lemkos living now in western and northern Poland, post-war Poland, were not about to give up their religion. And remember, there are two religious orientations, Greek Catholic on the one hand, Orthodox on the other. In the case of the Orthodox, there did exist in Poland, ever since the early 1920s after World War I, a jurisdictionally distinct or autocephalous Polish Orthodox Church. And under the communists, Orthodoxy remained a legal religious body, and that Orthodox Church set up new parishes in those lands in Silesia and Pomerania, where Orthodox Lemkos and Orthodox Ukrainians now lived. As for the Greek Catholics, the situation a bit more complex. After 1956, they were allowed, those who were left, to form parishes, but only if they attached those parishes to existing Roman Catholic ones. So usually what they did is that they could use a Roman Catholic church in the afternoon, one chapel on the side, or something out back somewhere. Eventually, 68 of those Greek Catholic parishes were formed, mostly again in Silesia and Pomerania. Now, since the majority of Poland's Greek Catholics were ethnically Ukrainian, because Ukrainians, more of them were deported to the West than Lemkos, it was that language, Ukrainian, which was gradually introduced into church services, and that was a transition basically completed by the 1980s. This Ukrainian factor, which we keep mentioning, had a particularly negative impact with regard to the relationship of Lemkos to the larger Polish society. Remember, Lemkos are identified as Ukrainian. Whether they believe it or not, or whether they are or not, that's irrelevant. Even though the vast majority of Lemkos neither provided assistance, nor were even near the UPA units right after the war, they nonetheless were lumped together with Ukrainians in the minds of Poles. They're all bad. Anyone from the East is bad, especially those Ukrainians. And now the Lemkos, for them, they're just another variant of Ukrainians. And it is in this context we should note that Poland had a centuries-long tradition of military conflict, first with the Cossacks of Ukraine going back to the 16th and 17th century, ongoing tensions and mutual hatred between Poles and Ukrainians made only worse in the 20th century with a full-fledged war right after World War I for control of Galicia. And then during World War II, the last years of it, a civil war for control of Volhynia and in particular Galicia. All of that was fresh in the minds of many people in post-war Poland, who aside from military casualties during World War II, an estimated 50,000 Polish civilians were killed in the region of Volhynia alone, that now part of northwestern Soviet Ukraine. And most of the Poles who were resettled from those regions had lost family members in that recent conflict. And so not surprisingly, they harbored strong antipathy toward Ukrainians in general. For most Poles in post-war Poland, the Lemkos that they encountered in these Western recovered lands that were part of their Polish country were, as I said, simply a regional variant of those hated Ukrainians. And it is for these reasons that many Lemko parents refused to send their children to the few Ukrainian language minority schools that were eventually opened up by the Polish government. The response of young Lemkos to this situation was to conceal their ethnic identity, to avoid as much as possible any association with the East, to speak Polish, and if possible to intermarry with Poles, if you could find a Polish girl and parents who would allow this. After all, Lemkos and Ukrainians in post-war Poland are pariahs. And in effect, then, the young Lemkos would do anything to become Polish, Poles. The generally oppressive atmosphere in communist Poland did begin to change somewhat after 1956. This has to do with changes in the Soviet Union and with strong Stalinist style was being lessened a bit. And that had an impact on its satellite countries. The following year, 1957, a Polish government-sponsored organization was created called the Ukrainian Civic and Cultural Society. The Ukrainian Civic and Cultural Society. Just like we had a Ukrainian Workers' Society in Czechoslovakia, so now we have one in Poland. It's based in Warsaw. It's under the direct control of the Ministry of the Interior. It has branches throughout the country. And the society's goal was to promote Ukrainian culture and language. Schools, theaters, ensembles, newspapers. All these activities were funded by the communist Polish government, which considered this civic and cultural society as, quote-unquote, the official representative of the Ukrainian national minority. And of course, that included Lemkos. And therefore, as the only legitimate spokesperson for not only Ukrainian, but Lemko interests. Now, there were some efforts to create a separate Lemko civic organization, but these were not successful because of Polish governmental policy. Well, I've already mentioned how the attitude toward Lemkos were. There were no Carpatho-Rusyns, etc. But officially, the chief ideologist of the Communist Party of Poland had to make a statement on this matter, and this was the statement and the explanation. And I quote him: "Every citizen of Poland has the right to declare his or her national preference. He must, however, choose only from those identities recognized as nationalities. And in this regard, one must point out that there is no Lemko nationality. And therefore, the authorities only permitted the creation in 1959 of a section for the development of Lemko culture within the framework of the Ukrainian Civic and Cultural Society. As a result of governmental policy, Polish governmental policy, there did appear in Poland, as in neighboring Czechoslovakia, a certain number of Lemko-Rusyn cultural activists who, whether out of conviction or political necessity, identified as Ukrainians. And then there were others who preferred to avoid altogether any discussion about the nationality question. Just leave me alone. I live in Poland. I'm going to try to be Polish. Now, the political situation in Poland itself began to change in the 1980s. Less government control over all aspects of society. And that gave rise to a cultural awakening among Lemkos known as the Vatra. Vatra is a word that means, in English, a bonfire. You know, you get together and you make a fire and you roast your marshmallows or cook your hot dogs or whatever you do. So it's just the same kind of thing, usually amongst the family. Well, now we have this bigger family, Lemkos. And in effect, this Vatra movement or Vatra phenomenon was a loosely organized gathering of enthusiasts, no government support. Actually, surprisingly, because it was the 1980s, no intervention by the authorities. This couldn't happen in the 50s or the 60s or even the 70s. But in the 80s, okay. And so these enthusiasts would gather together for a weekend each summer to hear concerts, lectures, and other entertaining activities, all with the underlying purpose of teaching people about Lemko-Rusyn culture and history. Certainly, it's total ancient history from you, but maybe you've heard in terms of popular culture and popular music, Woodstock, the famous place in the United States where in the 60s people gathered together with music and drugs and sex, etc., out on a field. Here it was music, not much sex, no drugs, but a lot of alcohol, and then a lot of lectures about who Lemko-Rusyns were. The first Vatra took place in 1983 on a hillside between two villages in the Lemko region. And then Vatras were repeated each summer, year after year, so that by the second half of the 1980s, the annual event drew anywhere between 4,000 and 8,000 participants. So this was, a pretty popular thing. It was an alternative to government-controlled activity. In effect, the Vatra phenomenon played a critical and very successful role in creating grassroots movement whose participants understood and welcomed the idea that Lemko-Rusyns were a distinct people whose culture and language were both a source of individual pride as well as something worthy of preservation for future generations.